Good evening. You're very welcome. I'm Peter Dunn, and you're tuned into the penultimate episode in Series 1 of our new Farming, Food and Rural Affairs panel discussion show here on the Irish Inquiry channel, simply titled Grassroots. Now, we're in episode 7 this week, ladies and gentlemen, and we've had what, in terms of many of our viewers, have given us feedback and have viewed as a very, very educational and informative and an interesting series of programs. And you can watch those programs back on all of our platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter and YouTube. And we would very much welcome your feedback, your comments, suggestions, recommendations and observations in terms of how we can improve the show. We do have one more show to bring to you next week, and we're going to take a summer recess at that point, and we'll call it a wrap. But hopefully in year 2 of the Irish Inquiry, we will be back with a second season of Grassroots. Now, as you can appreciate, ladies and gentlemen, it takes a lot of behind-the-scenes work and backroom preparation and technical prowess to get a programme like this to air. So we'd like to thank the Irish Inquiry, Stephen, and all of the backroom team for all of their efforts in facilitating the programme and providing us with the platform. This week, we have a slight pivot. We're going to talk about farmland biodiversity, and we have 2 wonderful guests to bring on the show, and we're hoping that they will engage in a really rich, informative and engaging thread of conversation. First of all, we have Fintan Damer, who is an ecologist and a horticulturalist. And then we're going to talk to Dr. Liam Lysett, who is the Centre Director for the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So we'd like to thank both of our guests for coming on the show tonight. And, as I'm always want to say to our guests, I am the host. That's fair enough. But without guests, there is no show. So again, to the 2 lads, we'd like to really thank them for giving up of their time freely to come on the show tonight. And indeed, to all of the wonderful guests who have been so generous with their time in coming on in each of the previous 6 episodes. So tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pivot a little bit, and we're going to, not talk about production agriculture to such a large extent, but we're going to talk about a concept which it's arguably, it's fair to say, is misunderstood, and that's biodiversity. And in recent decades, many would contend that the biodiversity in the Irish countryside has declined and continues to decline. Issues around biodiversity, ecotoxicity of agricultural chemicals, water quality, insect declines, effects on pollinators, farmland birds, these have all come into sharp focus. And do we now, more than ever, need a constructive dialogue between ecological and environmental lobbyists and their counterparts in farming and indeed agribusiness? And can there ever be such a dialogue? Or is it more a case of ne'er the twain shall meet? And what are the problems in the Irish countryside in relation to biodiversity? And what are the longer term trends telling us? Are farmers responsible? Or are there larger issues and perhaps even societal forces at play? And to what extent are any such forces culpable for the biodiversity issues and biodiversity losses that face us? So with our 2 guests, we hope to have a very information-rich discussion. But to you, our viewers, as we always like to say, prepare the hot beverage of your choosing, tea, coffee, or not, as the case may be. But please do pull up a comfy chair, sit back, relax, and prepare to enjoy the next hour or so with us here on Grassroots. So, ladies and gentlemen, our first guest this evening is an ecologist and horticulturalist, and his name is Fintan Damer. Fintan, you're very, very welcome onto the show. Thanks very, very much for giving up your time on actually what is a really beautiful, Wednesday evening in sort of early summer. So thanks very much for coming on. It's really very much appreciated. Fintan, as I always say to our guests, can you maybe tell us a little bit about your background, a little bit about yourself, and if I could ask you then the question, what is biodiversity?
Sure. Well, as you said in your introduction, I'm an ecologist and a horticulturist, so you could change them around really. in some respects, I've had 30 years or so of a career in horticulture, and the ecology really has only come about in the last number of years. But it was always an aspect of my horticultural work as well. So in a way, I'm kind of going back to my roots. I'm mostly working as an ecologist now, and I've put the horticulture on the back burner, but it's still there. I've had a long career in it, and it's still an aspect of what I do. To answer your question about biodiversity, well, biodiversity really it's a very big word for what essentially is just nature, you know. People get wrapped up in phraseology and large words that some people find difficult to understand, difficult to grasp, really. But essentially, biodiversity is just nature. It's all the creatures that we live around, that live around us, that we see every day. All the insects, all the birds, all the mammals, everything in the sea, the fish, the whole lot, and how they all interact together. And that's essentially what biodiversity is. It's diversity, and just put the bio in front of it.
Okay, fantastic. And I suppose I might just interject at this point, because I know, fortunately enough, the month of May this year is the Festival of Farmland Biodiversity Month. And I'm not sure if any of our viewers are actually aware of that. And as luck would have it, or just by sheer coincidence, by dumb luck, tomorrow is actually World Bee Day. So that's another one for our viewers to look into. And Fintan, moving on then, you know, what do you think, in terms of from your experience, are the major issues or the major challenges with biodiversity in an area, and maybe not even speaking particularly to agriculture or its effects, although I mean obviously there are effects. I mean all agriculture has an ecological impact implicitly. What are the major ecological challenges that we face in Ireland?
I think to a large extent it's grasping the nettle and understanding exactly what a biodiversity decline is and how it will affect us going forward. I don't think it's generally taken seriously. I think nature sometimes is looked on as something nice to see, but realistically, we can still carry on without it. The reality of it is much different. And in the context of, and you mentioned farming, but I mean, it's biodiversity loss is across the board. It's in the seas, it's in our forests, it's in our soil, it's everywhere. Yes, farming definitely has a big role to play in restoring it, but it is everywhere. And there's some parts of biodiversity that are essentially untouched, really, in terms of our knowledge of them. I mean, the sea is a huge area. I mean, we just don't know what's down there. You can look out to the sea any day of the week, and it looks the same now as it did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. We're just not noticing what's been lost there. You know, we see it on land more so than at sea, and so that's probably a bigger issue in some respects than even farmland. You know.
Okay. And, you know, I was going to maybe address the question broadly of, you know, farming and how farming is practiced. I mean, you know, with that full spectrum of options, going from, you know, even beyond organic, you can talk about agroecology, biodynamic conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture, all the way to, you know, mainstream intensive, and you know, how important is agriculture in terms of how it's practiced, in terms of the effects that it has on biodiversity and farmland? And, you know, is it a kind of I might say, to coin a phrase, and I'm not quite sure if this is accurate, because, you know, as an ecologist might view it, is it a little bit like, is a biodiversity decline a little bit like a silent disease?
Yeah, I suppose it is really. I mean, it happens slowly, really. Do you know what I mean? Over a long period of time, we tend to forget, you know, the changes. We don't see the changes sometimes, you know, unless we're very conscious of it. I mean, I can remember in my childhood seeing things that just don't exist anymore. But for most people, they wouldn't notice that, you know. I mean, you can think of it as something as simple as the Curlew. Everyone knows what Curlew is. There's only 150 pairs of them left in Ireland now. And there was 3,000 pairs of them going back 30 years ago. So that's just an example. And there's many other examples just like that, and that we haven't really noticed. We've kind of taken our eye off the ball. There's a lot of talk about Curlew now in the last couple of years, and there's European innovation projects being run now to try and bring back the Curlew and restore the population. But we really have left it to the last minute, and that seems to be the case with a lot of the species that we're losing, you know.
And just on the Curlew there, Fintan, I mean, I'm
Yeah.
quite shocked by those numbers.
Yeah.
You know, and I know people will probably, some viewers, you know, may decry the accuracy of the numbers or whatever, but I mean, that's quite a shocking demise.
Yeah.
And what do you think? I mean, I've a pretty good idea, but in your estimation, what do you think have been the main factors, for example, just alone in the decline of the Curlew, just to pick one sort of one species?
Well, for Curlew, I think it's intensification. Really, that's essentially, if you wanted in one word. So that's everything from going from having meadows to now having ryegrass swards almost from one side of the country to the other. Draining wetlands. I mean, Curlew rely on kind of wet grassland for their chicks to be reared, you know. And the adults need a body of water somewhere nearby where they can feed as well. And that's a pretty rare thing to have now in any one location. You can come onto a farm and walk from one end to the other, but you won't see any water. And you know, that's a major thing for curlews. They absolutely have to have that, and you can say that about all of our wader species that are in decline. So you know, snipe, that's a recent one that's in decline, that we would have considered kind of ubiquitous, really, to be on nearly every farm in Ireland, but they're in major decline now as well, and now they're actually just recently red listed, which means they're birds of critical conservation concern. So curlews aren't the only one. Lapwings, redshank, so many others, but the curlew is getting the show at the moment, because it really is on the edge, on the brink of disappearing, really. I mean, 150 pairs is nothing. They could be gone in 10 years if we don't do something now, you know.
And just on that, I mean, that just raises, and again, we reasonably free form, non-adversarial, to save the curlew, so that we don't in 10 years find that there are no curlews left. You know, what kind of measures, in your view, are needed?
I think, you know, you could walk into any farm in Ireland or any field in Ireland nearly, and you'll find a wet corner in it somewhere. But these are disappearing big time, you know. We're draining all the land. You know, wet grasslands have almost vanished. We've got improved grassland everywhere, ryegrass sward everywhere. They're the major things, you know, the loss of wetlands. So you know, if you want to help something like that, help something like the curlew, well, just, you know, leave those wet pieces. They're not necessarily huge areas. It could be just one field in an entire farm, and that could be enough to save several pairs of curlew breeding on just one farm, you know. Small things, you know, small actions in most cases, but we're chipping away all the time, chipping away, and it's these small little actions that we don't perceive are having an impact that actually are having an impact when you add them up, you know. Okay,
so this is, I suppose, in ecological thinking, this is, you know, what are seemingly very small measures, but having an amplified impact, or having, you know, sort of a non-linear effect, you know, rippling through the entire ecosystem. And I know it's something that we might touch on, you know, probably in the second half hour, after we've also talked to Liam, but you know, the notion, and I read something today actually, I think it was on the Regenerative Farming Ireland Facebook page, about a farmer who was actually clearing. Now, I think it was another farmer, and there were rumours, but they were actually clearing an area, a couple of acres, maybe 2-3 acres of scrub, essentially because the department had informed them that they weren't eligible for payments, so they were actually going to clear that. So, I mean, this seems to be this discordance between, if you like, you know, at least as far as I'm aware of it, good agricultural and environmental condition. The environmental, the GAEC, the environmental component. I mean, there's this discordance and there's this disconnection and this just incongruity between the whole thing, where it just hasn't been thought through. And I mean, do we really need to look, and I suppose it's axiomatic, but do we really need to look again at the schemes? And, have we missed the opportunity in this round of CAP, or if we have, what else could we do?
Well, CAP is not signed off yet, hopefully, anyway, because there's a few things they could change, and that's certainly one of them. This idea that, you have to clear your scrub or you're going to lose part of your payments, it's just plain crazy, Scrubland, I mean, even the word scrub is a terrible word, really, for what essentially is a very valuable habitat. There's so many birds that rely on scrub. And scrub is, for want of a better way of describing it, it's basically how a forest starts off. If you don't have scrub, you're never going to have natural regeneration of forest, So it's an extremely valuable habitat to have. This idea that, government policy or EU policy says you have to clear it, it's just crazy. It just doesn't make sense at all. And farmers are stuck in the middle of it, feeling like they have to do it, because if they don't, they're going to lose their payments. And it's just totally wrong. And that's one thing that absolutely needs to be changed, probably above anything else, I think, really,
So we really, I suppose what we really need, Fintan, then, is to see farmers treated not just as food producers, but almost on an equal footing. If there was a genuine conversation about sustainability, whatever that word actually means, and obviously it may mean myriad things to myriad different vested interests, but if there's going to be a genuine discussion, therefore we need to have a view in, let's say, in government, whatever about corporates, but certainly in government and administrative circles, that farmers are custodians of the landscape.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, currently we farmers gain their payments from producing, but what about the idea of producing habitat or producing species and paying them for that instead? Why is it always based around food production and exports and bulk products? Why not base it on how long your hedgerows are, how good a condition your hedgerows are in, what sort of wetland you have on your farm, do you have ditches beside your hedges, all this kind of thing. Do you have wet grassland? Are you maintaining that wet grassland and paying accordingly to that? This idea that we're only paying for product, for exports value, it's just not going to work. It's not sustainable. If we carry on like this, 20 years time, there's going to be no biodiversity. There's possibly going to be no farmers either, because we're actually destroying the land as well when we're destroying biodiversity. It just doesn't work as is.
So you mentioned, Fintan, you mentioned hedgerows, and I know it's something that you want to delve into a little bit more deeply this evening. And I think we have a couple of pictures there. I think we have a picture of a hedgerow. So I mean, and we have quite a nice contrast, Fintan. I mean, can you sort of, from an ecologist's point of view, and this is a kind of a two-tiered question, can you, from the point of view of the trained eye of an ecologist, tell us what that picture is telling us, what we're seeing in that picture, and then on a broader footing, just how important are hedgerows in an ecological and a biodiversity context?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should say this is actually one of Liam's photos that he put up on Twitter, I think it was, the other day. I thought it was an excellent example of what we're doing to our hedges. In the foreground, you're seeing the standard roadside hedge, really, and further away, you're seeing what a hedge could be. And essentially, I mean, that's a roadside hedge there, the whole length of it. But there's really no difference in terms of road safety between one and the other. They both work fine. There's no loss of vision along that road, and yet we're led to believe that we should be maintaining hedges like the one in the foreground here. And for most people, they think, well, neat and tidy, and it works. You know what I mean? It serves its purpose. It's functional. It keeps cattle in, and it's not causing any road issues. But the impact of maintaining a hedge like that is massive. Do you know what I mean? That hedge really essentially has no biodiversity value whatsoever, And if that picture had been taken maybe 2 or 3 weeks after it is, you'd see the big difference there, because that's a hawthorn hedge largely, and that would be that hedge that isn't cut will be absolutely covered in flowers, whereas the one in the foreground will have almost no flowers. So even from our pollinators' point of view, you know, there's no comparison between the two. And then of course you can move on, because I mean, through the seasons, eventually that hawthorn hedge is going to have berries, which feed all our farmland birds, or a lot of our farmland birds, all our thrushes, some of our smaller species as well. That'll be missing from that near hedge, because it's been cut and cut routinely every year. And when you cut a lot of woody species, particularly ones that flower early in the year, like hawthorn and blackthorn, if you cut them in the winter, that hedge is stimulated to just reproduce vegetatively. In other words, it's trying to recover its lost wood, if you know what I mean. So essentially it puts no effort into flowering, no effort into producing berries. So it's just a green bush, essentially. It's of zero value. But it all boils down to, in some respects, lack of knowledge, I think. You know what I mean? People don't think that's bad. You know what I mean? That near hedge is a bad hedge, and it is. It doesn't produce anything. But in a lot of cases, I think people just don't realise that hedge doesn't produce anything. They don't realise that it doesn't have produced berries. They think it's still going to flower regardless. You know, for hawthorns in particular, or blackthorn, they need timber that's at least 2 years old. And if you're cutting the hedge every season, every winter, that'll never have that 2-year-old growth. And so it's never going to flower, and it's never going to produce berries, you know. And so that hedge in the background there, that possibly hasn't been cut in 5, 6, 7 years, and it's probably flowering really well and producing a lot of berries, you know. And the other issue I have with hedgerow cutting is, you'll find that hedgerow in the foreground will fire up loads of new growth over the next 3 to 4 months. Really long, vigorous growth, far more than the hedge in the background. That hedge essentially in the foreground will try to recover. It'll try to produce what it's lost, basically. So it'll put up 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 foot of growth in a single year. Whereas the hedge in the background will probably only produce maybe 4 or 5 inches of growth, maybe not even that. Because what that hedge is trying to do is produce flower and produce seeds, putting all its effort into that. So, you know, you'd have to question, you know, are we making work for ourselves by flailing hedges every year? You're having to cut away that 5 or 6 foot of growth every year, whereas the hedge in the background, you know, there's only 4 or 5 inches of growth in a year, maybe not even that, maybe less. So there's really no work in that at all. You can see from that hedge it's been flailed on the side, obviously just for road safety issues. You know what I mean? So that's fine. That in a way kind of mimics natural browsing of any vegetation that you'd see anywhere in a natural environment, in a forest edge or anything. You mean you'll get your browsers and natural herbivores would do that anyway, so that's okay. But that hedge really does produce big time compared to the one in the foreground, you know.
So really then, Fintan, if I can just then extract from what you're saying that, I suppose, that the real take-homes there are that what we're seeing in the foreground is, I mean, it really smacks of a lack of knowledge, lack of ecological, botanical knowledge, just knowledge of nature. I mean, is it arguable that we've actually, you know, lost that knowledge from, you know, even in the last, let's say, 3-4 decades? Or is it partly due to lack of knowledge, but also for example, due to, you know, is it mechanization?
Yeah, I think mechanization is a big factor in it. I can certainly remember when there was no flails around. When I was a young child, it was circular saws. That's what we used, and they weren't used every year. You know, they were used maybe every 5 or 8 or maybe 10 years. You know, if you take a hedge that's only cut with a circular saw once in every 10 years, well, 8 of those 10 years, it's going to produce flower and it's going to produce berries. So that's a lot better than a hedge that doesn't produce anything for year after year after year after year, you know. So flails have done a lot of damage. the use of flails, it's very handy, it's very neat, and there's no cleaning up after it. But from a biodiversity point of view, they've been a disaster,
So in a sense, the priority and the perspective has been wrong, in the sense that it's really about aesthetic functionality, and it's about what looks good to our perception as opposed to what's ecologically functional.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're seeing lately, I've noticed anyway, you'll nearly every hedgerow in Ireland now that's along a roadway looks like that one in the foreground, but it's starting to spread into the fields. The fields between the fields. You know what I mean? All these hedgerows now are getting the same job with the flail. You know what I mean? Even though there's absolutely no issues regarding road safety, obviously, So people are perceiving this as the right thing to do, and they're saying, okay, well, let's carry on with this. Let's do all the hedges in the farm,
So really, it's an issue, and I mean, it's something we might touch on later. I mean, it's an issue of education. Really.
Yeah,
and just people not alone not knowing, but completely doing the opposite of what they actually should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's I mean, obviously nobody's going out on purpose to try and get rid of biodiversity, but that's what's happening essentially, and education has a lot to do with it. I often question, what do our agricultural colleges teach the young and upcoming farmers regarding biodiversity? Surely something like hedgerow maintenance is something that I could teach myself in a few hours. You know what I mean? It's not a big thing. It's not a big subject to kind of grasp. Could easily be done.
Absolutely,
yeah. I don't think our agricultural colleges put on any effort whatsoever into teaching, about ecology or biodiversity or nature, or farming with nature. Do you know what I mean? That's really what we're looking at here.
Okay, so I mean, it's something I think we might just touch back on again in the second half of the show, but I know it's something that we're going to address next week. In next week's show, we're going to talk about agricultural education, and maybe just one final question then to finish off briefly, Fintan. When we look at the picture there, how many species and different types of species would be typically in or around a hedgerow and a field margin in Ireland?
Well, I would say certainly from woody species. So when I say woody species, I'm talking about the hawthorns, the blackthorns, guelder rose, all these kind of things, honeysuckles, wild rose, dog rose, all these type of things. In a good hedge, in your average good hedge, I'd say there could easily be 6-7 species. But you could have hedges that have maybe 10-12 species of woody species. That would be considered a very rich hedgerow, And then, of course, you've all the herbaceous stuff as well, which generally people don't notice about, don't calculate the value of them. Do you know what I mean? You look along a nice bit of road these days, and somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Do you know what I mean? That doesn't get much maintenance. You'll see the cow parsley everywhere at the moment. That kind of stuff is hugely valuable for our pollinators too. So that forms part of the hedge as well. And there could quite literally be 100 different species of herbaceous plants in any given hedgerow,
Okay,
and then you've got, of course, the trees as well. So I mean, they're a big element of it as well,
Okay, and that's obviously not even to talk about the range of mammals and invertebrates that we could mention.
Absolutely,
and avian species. So I mean, you're talking probably in the low hundreds.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, if you were to factor in everything, every insect and every mammal, every bird, every plant species, every moss species, you know what I mean? There's everything in a hedgerow, even on the trees themselves. You know what I mean? What grows on the trees apart from the trees themselves? There could literally, you could literally be talking 5, 6, 7, 800, maybe 1,000 species in any hedgerow. I mean, that's ginormous. Do you know what I mean? We don't value our hedgerows in Ireland the way we should value them. I mean, we don't have any major areas of natural forests in Ireland. There's only about 1.5% of native forests in Ireland. We've 450,000 acres or hectares, I should say, of hedgerow and scrub, and we don't value it the way we should be valuing it. That is our woodlands, basically. Our hedgerows are. All the elements in a hedgerow are the same ones that you get in a good forest. It's just the fact that they're in a line, we don't see the value of them. They're not covering a huge area, a block of space. You know what I mean? But they are hugely valuable, and Ireland's kind of unique from that point of view.
So really, I mean, in that sense, I mean, if we aspire at a national level to either to maintain or even to retain biodiversity, we really have to. And again, this is against the backdrop where we're hearing increasing stories about land consolidation and hedgerows being removed. But if we want to actually address the issue of biodiversity loss, and we want to maintain or retain what we have, we really have to. Apart from wetland areas, is the big ticket item hedgerows. We got to look after our hedgerows.
Yeah, well, there's nearly every farm in Ireland has some area of hedgerow on it. So there's a simple thing that any farmer could do.
So it is, pardon the pun, it is the low-hanging fruit.
Absolutely. It's the obvious one. It's in our faces. Okay. It's there every day. All you have to do is look after it. I mean, we've talked about the difference there between those two different types of hedges. I mean, that just says it alone. We don't have to create anything new. That hedge could be recovered. That near ground hedge could be recovered to look like the one behind it, And actually, just another point that now that I'm just looking at that photo again, if you look further down that hedge, there's some trees, probably an ash tree. In the one nearest us, there's no trees. So I mean, that in itself is a big factor in terms of where do we get our new trees from then if we're going to just flail our hedges all the time? We don't, is the answer. We won't have any trees. We won't. I mean, our trees in our hedgerows are dying out. They're all old trees, and if we treat all our hedges with a flail every year, we've nothing to replace those old trees. Essentially, we could find in 50 or 100 years time, we just have hedgerows with no trees in them whatsoever.
So quite shocking, really. Yeah. Okay. Fintan, that's a really rich contribution. And I mean, I just want to say thank you very much, firstly, for coming on the show and really for having that rich vein of conversation and so many insights, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, our guests this evening are Fintan Damer, who is an ecologist and horticulturalist, and who's just given us some really valuable insights there on many aspects of biodiversity and a special expose, if you will, on hedgerows and the state of our hedgerows. Our other guest tonight, ladies and gentlemen, in the show in which we're talking about farmland biodiversity in what is the month of farmland, the Festival of Farmland Biodiversity, the month of May, is Dr. Liam Lysett. And Liam is the Centre Director of the National Biodiversity Data Centre. Liam, you're very, very welcome on to Grassroots, and thank you so much for giving up your time on what is a fantastic early summer Wednesday night, although it is getting, as I speak, it's getting a little bit darker. But Liam, thank you very much for coming on the show. As I always, again, say to our guests, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and maybe tell us about the National Biodiversity Data Centre and what your role is and what the centre does.
Great. Well, Peter, thank you for the invitation to come on. I'm always delighted to do things like this. I suppose my own background is I'm an inner city kid, actually. I grew up right on the banks of the Shannon in Limerick City. But my parents came from farming stock, so we would have spent an awful lot of time in North Kerry. So I suppose I had the mixture of as I say, being a inner city child, but also spending a lot of time in the countryside and kind of straddling both. And I'll be turning 60 next year, so that gives you some indication of my vintage. But I suppose I would have been familiar with the countryside and the dramatic change that happened in the countryside in North Kerry in the 1970s when we entered the European EEC at the time. So I think I would have experienced, my background would have been spending a long time in North Kerry. I remember like hundreds of acres of wet, species-rich grassland that in the space of, a couple of years were transformed into ryegrass fields. And the transformation really of the countryside was dramatic. But I think I know we're talking about agriculture tonight, but I think it's important to make the point, and Fintan mentioned it, is that biodiversity loss isn't just a rural issue, it's also an urban area. I grew up, as I mentioned, on the banks of the Shannon, right at the Curlew in Limerick City. And I've two memories really from there. Is that in the evenings, in the balmy summer evenings, there'd be literally hundreds of swift screeching around the sky in the evenings. And of course, that species has become threatened since the 1970s. And similarly, I grew up just beside a fishing community. There was a community of fishermen on the Curlew, and they used to bring in the salmon that they caught in the estuaries up as far as the Curlew and unload it every day. So as we know, salmon stocks have declined. They're threatened, but they're not yet extinct. Yet the heritage and the community around the fishing community there has become extinct. So I think biodiversity and biodiversity loss actually kind of hits us, and it might impact on us in quite unsuspecting ways. So I suppose that's just a little bit of colour, Peter, just to give you an idea of my background. And I suppose these are my formative years, and there were things that got me interested in the state of the countryside and wildlife. I moved on to Dublin. I actually did a PhD on farmland birds, and then I moved into working in a national park, and then into developing policy with the Heritage Council, and now as I'm with the National Biodiversity Data Centre. And I suppose the key thing we try to do is we try to present the evidence for what's happening with biodiversity across the country. We can all speculate about what's happening, and sometimes our own circumstances change over the years, and then we don't see things, or we experience different things. It's hard to actually find out what's happening. So we try to bring kind of science and evidence to try to present information on the state of biodiversity in the countryside. So that's it in a nutshell, really.
No, that's a fantastic answer, Liam. I mean, thank you very much. That's a very rich contribution. I mean, and again, that's to mention that some of the feedback that we've gotten about grassroots is that all of our guests are very knowledgeable, but also that viewers are actually finding it extremely educational. So, in that vein, or in that context, Liam, then can I ask you, what's your, and again, this may be a simple question, but not to be trite, what is biodiversity, and what do you think are the main biodiversity challenges that we face in the country?
Quite simply, again, another simple answer, biodiversity really is a fancy term for describing the variety of life that we get. And I suppose it explains the concepts that actually everything is interconnected. So that if you go, there's not any one species in isolation, but there's a whole community of organisms and humans as well. We're all in it together. So it's really just a kind of an overall, I suppose, fancy term really to describe the variety of life. I think the overall challenge really is that across everything we're doing, we're simplifying things, even agricultural production systems. We're trying to simplify them. So the variety and the diversity of farming landscapes has changed, and the diversity of actually farming practices. In North Kerry, I keep coming back to North Kerry, there would be characters who would farm in a way that might be the most productive, and then there was a good productive farmer. There was an awful lot of variability within the farming community, within the ways that land was farmed. And the trend really since the 1970s has just to become much more uniform, much more productive driven, which actually helps. Everything is there's a sameness about everything. You have a good dairy production system, no matter what part of the country it is, it's probably very similar. You'd have a beef production system. And again, it's all kind of trying to farm to some kind of standard, and the consequence of that is just the diversity and the variability within the countryside is being lost. And that's the biggest challenge. How do we bring back this variety and diversity back into the rural landscape? That's really the challenge, I think.
And just if I can maybe just pick up on that, Liam, because again, what I'm always acutely conscious of with guests is to actually listen to do the service of actually listening to the guest. And you've mentioned that there's a sameness and there's a uniformity and a homogeneity to farming practices and to farm management. And, the first thing that strikes me is that, as any farmer will say, there's farm to farm variation, but equally within a farm, you'll have differences from field to field in terms of soil, in terms of topography, aspect, drainage, in terms of, if you're looking at the natural, baseline vegetation, you'll have variation from field to field. And I'm just wondering, this sameness, is this, is this losing an opportunity for kind of thinking a little bit outside the box and, adapting farming systems to a particular context, be that in, that can be, let's say, in the south of Kerry, it can be on the border in Cavan, it can be it can be in Wexford or in Galway, wherever it may be, that, we're actually, and again, this is not to moralize and it's certainly not to blame farmers, but have farmers been, poorly informed, poorly educated, probably for the last 30 years in terms of what I'll call the industrial model. And it's not just the use of agrochemicals and fertilizers, but this thing where everything is standardized, everything is simplified. And that one of the things that strikes me is that we can actually have, you can call it high nature value farming. And maybe that's that's a moniker almost in itself. But that we're actually losing an opportunity to create, what, for example, in France is referred to as terroir. I mean, is that something so there doesn't have to be this incompatibility between maintenance of biodiversity, maintenance of nature, and actually producing very high quality premium food products?
Yeah, well, I do think that the drive is all to standardize, and everything that goes with that is, there's ways of doing it. You try to get, the soil moisture down. You try to get the fertility up. You fertilize. So it's kind of like, I'll be the first to admit I don't know really anything about the details about farming, but I do walk the land and I'm observant. There is a drive to try to standardize everything. And I just ask the question really is that if you have a wet field where, there's a good species diversity of flora, which is a really high value for a biodiversity point of view. If you have this and it's difficult to farm, that to keep it to, to what's considered a standard, you have to maybe drain it every few years. You have to fertilize it. You might have to cut rushes. You have to do all this. Perhaps another way might be to say, well, you're trying to work against nature the whole time, really, and that's what's causing the damage to biodiversity. Is there a way in which actually maybe the yields mightn't be that great in terms of productivity? But then Fintan mentioned it again, if we could get into the mindset that there's some other benefits accruing from not maximizing the production from that field, maybe that's the solution. Then, the pressures could be taken off a small bit. I think it would be good in terms of carbon and all this, and that farm it in a way that's a small little bit more in tune with the natural limitations, I suppose, of the field. And I know the drive is all much towards productivity and getting output, but it's more, I suppose there's a harsh economic reality as well. But the mindset about can we find ways to be to farm a bit more closer to the natural cycles and the conditions that you find in different fields? It'll be difficult, but I think that's the challenge, really, to do that or find ways to do that, and maybe find ways to incentivize farmers to do that.
No, that's very, very informative, Liam. And look, you've said, in asking the question, that's a perfectly legitimate way to address something. There's a quote from the late Neil Postman. And ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't heard of Neil Postman, maybe look him up on YouTube. And Neil Postman, he's written a number of wonderful books that I've read in the context of pedagogy. The End of Education, How to Watch the TV News, which is actually a very, very good book, which I would highly recommend to people. But the late Neil Postman, he said that questions are the principal intellectual instruments available to human beings. So we love, and on Grassroots, we love asking questions. And even if our guests are asking questions, Absolutely, you're most welcome, Liam. And it's in asking the questions that we can increase awareness, because some people, in some cases, many people don't even know what they don't know, and they don't know what question to ask. But I'm just wondering, if we can pivot slightly, Liam. Your area, your PhD is in birds, and if we pivoted to farmland birds, Liam, or maybe just birds in general, and it's something Fintan touched on earlier. What are our major issues in terms of bird life in Ireland? What are the major trends? If you want to maybe mention about farmland birds specifically, please do. But I just completely open it to the floor and just take it away, please, Liam.
Yeah, well, I think Fintan actually gave a very good account of what one aspects of farmland birds, and particularly the wading birds that breed on grasslands, mostly wet grasslands like the curlew, lapwing, redshank, and snipe. Their populations have plummeted in recent years, and that's a consequence really of how fields are managed. But hedgerow birds then would be the other kind of section of bird life, and hedgerow birds are doing probably all right. In terms of breeding numbers, we only have data from the late 1990s, because the Countryside Bird Survey was set up by Birdwatch Ireland. But yeah, there's no significant decline of hedgerow nesting birds that I think could be attributed to farmland. Then there's things like meadow pipit and skylarks as well, which nest in the fields, and those sadly are decreasing. So I think in terms of farmland birds, the big issue is in terms of how the fields are managed. If we continue to keep, as Fintan has shown, cutting hedgerows right down to stumps, we will get there's bound to be an impact on the number of breeding birds. Incidentally, probably yellowhammer is about the only species that I'm aware of that does actually quite well, or at least it tolerates low-cut hedgerows. It's confined to the arable parts of the country where arable is. There's arable farming, but I think the big challenge, I think, really is the grassland management. The knock-on I've mentioned, or Fintan has mentioned, about breeding waders, they also require an awful lot of insect life, and with the decline in the species-rich grasslands that have happened, there's been a huge decline in terms of insect life. Like, this is one of the things I don't think we've any comprehension in terms of the total, what we call biomass loss, over the last 30 or 40 years in agricultural landscapes. I mean, anyone of my age will know, if they were driving in a car in the 1970s, that in the evening there'd be clouds of insects, moths and things flying around. You just don't see that anymore. So the sheer abundance of insect life has plummeted, and there's no getting away from it. I'm not blaming anyone, but it's been hugely dramatic. But numbers really sometimes don't mean much. For me, it's the silence that I find extraordinary. And for me, what I think is iconic is you don't hear grasshoppers anymore. It's just one simple example of how silent the countryside. Like, when I know I was a child back in the 1970s, there was grasshoppers everywhere. I'd ask the listeners, when was the last time they heard a grasshopper? A small little creature that requires kind of small bit of, non-productive land to survive. And for me, it's very iconic, that one little sound of the summer. It seems to have gone.
Well, that's really that's tragic. And in fact, I suppose a lot of people might not know what a grasshopper even sounds like. I mean, it's self-evident that those declines are happening. I know it that's very consonant with the the study that was published, I think it was the Public Library of Science one, the study from the Citizen Science Initiative in Germany, where they found, I think they were studying in nature reserves as well, which you would expect to be, slightly biased in favor of higher biodiversity of insects and invertebrates, that they actually found a 75% decline over a 29-year period. And I'm just 2 questions on foot of that, Liam. Are we seeing, as far as you're aware, are we seeing those kinds of numbers, that kind of magnitude of a decline? And secondly, are there any similar citizen science initiatives in Ireland to monitor biodiversity?
Well, yeah, although we're in Ireland, we're experiencing exactly the same trends that are being seen worldwide in terms of species decline. So we're not immune from it. In fact, for some of the taxonomic groups, the declines might be even worse in Ireland than elsewhere. We do have data. We don't have a huge amount of data. For example, one of the projects I work on is we have an Irish butterfly monitoring scheme where we we've been tracking butterfly populations now for the last 13 years. And we've just finished the analysis for 2020. And we know that there's about 1% every year decline in common butterflies across the countryside. That doesn't perhaps sound too bad, but the decline is downwards. But the one thing we've discovered this year is that the population of the green-veined white, which is a very widespread species, is actually has declined by 47% since 2008. And species like the small heath, which is a butterfly associated with more what I'd probably call marginal agricultural land, kind of light grassland, that's declined by a shocking, 77% since 2008. So, Peter, the short answer is that yes, there's serious declines happening in Ireland. We have some insights into what is happening. We have some quantifiable data for some aspects like bumblebees, bees, butterflies, but there's a whole slew of biodiversity, the smaller creatures that we really don't know anything about, other than we're just making inferences in terms of the species declines, the last decades.
I mean, I was quite shocked, Liam. Actually, I think I read an article. It was in, I think it was on the Modern Farmer website, and they also have a magazine. You might be familiar with it, and maybe some of our viewers might be subscribers or might be familiar with it. And in Modern Farmer, they had an article, and it was about pollination services, so ecosystem services broadly. But in terms of pollination events, they were talking about the apple industry in upstate New York and how I think 6 million blossoms or 6 million individual pollination events were carried out by pollinating insects in upstate New York, completely, totally free. It's a free service by nature. I mean, they say nothing is free, but it's quite staggering when you think of that there doesn't seem to be and again, a lot of farmers may perceive this as kind of confrontational, but there doesn't seem to be imbued within the farming community, and certainly I think not in the agribusiness community. There doesn't seem to be this appreciation of in the sense that they want to put an economic or a financial value in everything. There doesn't, and there's arguments for and against that approach, certainly, but there doesn't seem to be this realization that of the economic value of ecosystem services. And I'm just wondering, I mean, do you have a view on that, Liam?
Well, look, you've mentioned it. I mean, there's evidence. We know exactly what kind of what contribution, the horticultural industry is supported by pollination services. It's very interesting, though, a point you made is that I think there's a kind of a conventional wisdom out there that farmers aren't interested in biodiversity, or that, they're not interested in pollinations and the like. And it's really surprising for me is that we have more and more through work now. We have more and more engagement with farmers, and the number of farmers who actually approach us and talk about biodiversity and what they can do. I think there's a groundswell of interest. Maybe concern is too much, but there's certainly interest within the farming community. People who aren't represented necessarily by farming unions, but they have a deep, deep interest in doing the right thing for their land. And like you've mentioned that we're running a kind of a virtual festival of farmland biodiversity this month. As a whole, the whole point really, the data center, we're trying to showcase some of the positive work that's been done out there and actually show people what you can do on a farmland to help biodiversity. It's astonishing the number of people who are doing huge amount of work to make their farm more biodiversity friendly, putting in large ponds, planting trees, re-wetting areas. And this is all coming in under the radar. So, the conventional view that farmers don't care about biodiversity or that they're only interested in one thing, I think that's only one perspective. And there is definitely the other where more and more people are, looking for trying to do things slightly differently, And I think that's really positive. And I think we should be trying to tap into that movement more, because like biodiversity loss is a challenging subject, and there's no silver bullet, and I can talk passionately about it, biodiversity loss, but I haven't a clue once it comes to farming practices. But there are farmers there who actually know what they're doing. They know what they need to do to help biodiversity, and getting a dialogue and probably getting some of these champions, I suppose, to show what they're doing is a great way to show a kind of a path forward in terms of how we might make the countryside more suitable again for biodiversity and all the kind of pollination services that are beneficial to us.
Oh, fantastic, Liam. I mean, I have so many questions, to be honest. And, I had one, it's not a question that I'd like you to address, but, sometimes I wonder, particularly in terms of insect biodiversity loss, is it, and I've read various articles and scientific papers down through the years, is it all or some combination of urbanization and all of that brings, including things like light pollution and the circadian rhythms of invertebrates and how they can be disturbed, even electrosmog, and Wi-Fi pervades everything. We can't touch it, taste it, smell it, feel it, but it's there. And perhaps that the invertebrates are much more sensitive to issues like having disturbances in circadian biology, disturbances due to electrosmog, as well as habitat loss from for example, urbanization or to some extent agriculture. I will come back to you, Liam. I just want to revert back to Fintan, and I'd like you to when we chat again in a couple of minutes, to maybe address the issue of the pollinators, I suppose, specifically. And what I'd like to do then to close out is, maybe to pivot away from farming, maybe have a think about, what your average householder. Now, that could be, it could be in Templeogue or it could be in Tinnahealy. It doesn't really matter, or it could be on a farm somewhere, in Galway or Wexford or Donegal. What can ordinary people do to sort of, champion biodiversity in their own circumstances? We'll chat again in a couple of minutes, Liam. Thank you very, very much for a really rich vein of conversation. Fintan, I'm going to come back to yourself. And, if I could ask you, and again, what I've said to guests is, there's no... It's free form, it's non-adversarial, no sneaky stuff. But I notice you're a horticulturalist, and what I maybe wanted to tease out was, mainstream farming and how compatible it is with championing and encouraging biodiversity on farm. Would it be fair to say that horticulture is more amenable to rather than, let's say, row crop monoculture tillage, or even intensive grassland management, that horticulture offers more opportunities to have a richer, a more diverse biodiversity?
Good question. I suppose it depends on what aspect of horticulture you're in. My career has essentially been in amenity horticulture. So I've worked in parks departments, I've worked in landscaping businesses, I've worked for myself for 20 years. And even in my business as a landscaper, this broad spectrum of types of landscaping out there. Those landscapers out there would have no problem coming in and covering your entire back garden in artificial grass. There's money in it, they'll do it. Simple as that. Same paving, all that sort of stuff that just covers up ground, covers up soil, seals off the earth from life, basically. That goes on. It's still going on, and it's probably being pushed even more. I mean, I've certainly found it, having worked for myself the last 4 or 5 years, seldom a week goes past when I don't get a call looking for artificial grass or looking to get rid of their planting, and they just want it paved. So there's a problem out there that's beyond agriculture. It's beyond anything like that. It's a societal problem that we're not joining the dots between biodiversity loss and what we're doing in our own spaces, whether that be our back garden or whether that be your 20-acre field.
So it's a bit like, maybe to pick up on something you said there. So it's a bit like the futurist John Michael Greer, when he talks about the future society as being full of technophiles and biophobes. So he talks about the biophobic society. So those kind of societal forces that I was talking about, farmers get a bad rap. And I think a lot of it, unfairly so. I mean, there's a proportion of, high intensity farmers who have a productivist mindset and, to be fair, like to portray themselves as, champions of biodiversity. And look, maybe they can do that, and that's fine. I mean, and we're not trying to moralize, but, it's not just about farmers. I mean, there are probably broader societal forces, but I'm going to ask you Liam's question before I get back to Liam, actually, because as a landscaper, what would you, if you were doing a consult with a client, and they were interested in biodiversity, what would be the kinds of measures that you would do in a domestic garden?
I'd probably say consider our native species. Our native plant species in your garden. You know what I mean? Use as many of them as you can. I mean, it doesn't work in everybody's garden space, depending on your garden space. But even just something as simple as we talked about hedgerows already, we see, I see it so many times, sites being cleared, beautiful hedgerows ripped out, house being built, householders move in and they replant a hedge, but it's not a native hedge. It's a gristlinia hedge, it's a privet hedge, or it's a Leylandia hedge, or whatever it might be, completely useless from a biodiversity point of view. There was a beautiful hedge there before that was torn out, very functional. And from my opinion, a lot nicer than this kind of monotoned, Leylandia or gristlinias or any of those type of things. Use our native species. Think of our native species first. Don't be afraid to have a patch in your garden that just let grow wild, let it rip, let everything grow on it. I'm doing it myself in my own garden at the moment. I've a grass verge at the front of my garden. There's about maybe 30 square meters in it. It's about 12 inches high now at the moment. I'm sure the neighbours are looking and thinking, what the hell is he up to? Is he not a landscaper, But I don't care. Do you know what I mean? Simple as that. I'm letting it do its own thing. I threw a bit of extra seed wild native seed into it last autumn. I'm hoping that'll make it look good in another couple of years' time, and people might look at it and think twice then, At the moment, they're just seeing long grass, but I'm hoping within a couple of years, it's going to be something pretty spectacular, and maybe might influence some of the locals, even some of the local farmers. I'm in a kind of a rural area here, so I'm open to try and influence anybody, and that's my little way of doing it. Sometimes it's hard to convince people until they actually see it, but if they actually see it, then maybe they might change.
Oh, fantastic! That's brilliant, Fintan. Well, Fintan, I mean that's a fantastic contribution, and thank you so much for coming on the show. And we might speak just briefly. We'll just close out in a few minutes. Liam, I'm coming back to yourself. what are the main, to talk about pollinators? And I think we've a graphic for the All Ireland pollinator plan as well. How important are pollinators in the whole scheme of things, Liam? If I could maybe just ask you what appears on the surface a very simple question.
No, look, they're very important. I think everyone understands that things like honey come from bees. They're from hives, but it's just people understand that flowers need to be pollinated by wild bees, hoverflies and the like, and they get it. You don't have to argue. People understand it, and I think they really are kind of I suppose a stalking horse really for biodiversity, because you don't have to argue that it's good to have pollinators, and people engage with that, and they're happy to help out. And I think any area that's managed well for pollinators will also be beneficial to other types of biodiversity. So they're kind of a totem pole, I suppose, in that way, and that it's an easy win for people, and it's an easy way to communicate the importance of biodiversity. Anywhere that's managed well for pollinators, you can be damn sure is probably doing very good for biodiversity in other parts as well. Okay,
that's very good. And finally, Liam, just to close out, and this is the same question that I've put to Fintan, for your average householder. Now your average householder could equally be a farmer, his wife, his partner, around the farmhouse, or so it could be, as I said, it could be Templeogue, it could be Tinnahealy. It could. What can people do just around the environs of the house and their gardens and their backyards, or whatever space they have? It could be a window box. I won't say any more about that. What can people do to kind of encourage biodiversity? Are there any sort of general principles that they can use?
Yeah, well, I think people like to mow their lawn. There's no problem with that. But perhaps two things you could do. You could actually defer mowing your lawn at the start of the year until mid-May, when the dandelions have flowered, because they're an important source of food for pollinators. And then just leave a small bit of your lawn. If you do like a manicured lawn, leave a small bit perhaps, and you cut it every 6 weeks. So that's not too much. A small strip of unmown grass cut every 6 weeks will do tremendous benefits for all of the garden. Another thing people don't, water is really important. Dig in a small basin into a corner of your garden, fill it with water, put a stone in the middle, and just let it evolve. It's incredible what it will do for biodiversity. And I would say just plant a few perennial plants. And can I just then, in terms of a farmer, there's probably two things I'd say. If there's parts of your farm that are difficult to farm for whatever natural constraints, leave it go. Don't try to farm it. Just step back a bit and let it take its all, because it's probably the areas that are actually of most biodiversity value. And otherwise, just give nature, wherever you can within your farm, a small little bit of space to allow it to flourish. Farmers are best placed themselves to know what part of their land they could, let's say, devote to nature without impacting on their production systems, and just encourage farmers to do that. It would be very beneficial in the long term.
Liam, that's really fantastic. I mean, that's a really concise answer. You've given us some very concise and very short, but very focused principles and focused actions that people can take. Both your householder or your farmer, who might have obviously has a bit more land, to improve biodiversity. Brilliant answer, Liam. And even personally, that's really, really informative. And gentlemen, we've had a really, really rich vein of conversation tonight. We've gone over the hour, as we're wont to do on the show here. So, but again, there's no ad breaks involved or anything. So that's quite all right. Thank you so much to both of our guests this evening, ladies and gentlemen, to Fintan Damer, who is an ecologist and horticulturalist, and to Dr. Liam Lysett, who is the Centre Director for the National Biodiversity Data Centre. You do a bit of landscaping, Fintan. I mean, where can people find you if you would like to give out those details? Or
funny you should ask that. I'm kind of more or less gone out of the landscaping, really.
Okay.
I'm essentially a full-time ecologist now. That my landscaping involves more advice than anything else now, whereas I still do a bit of consultancy, and certainly I do a bit of design still as well. And so actually I only designed a garden there recently. I say a garden, it was a 6-acre field for planning commission, but he got all his native species in it. There wasn't one foreign species in it, so whether he liked it or not, that's what he got, but he seemed happy with it. So
okay, but I mean, as you say, I mean, it's landscaping consultancy, but with an ecological bent. So looking
Exactly,
at that kind of looking at that function, looking at that job through an ecologist's eyes.
Yeah.
So it's
I
really
have a
a case of value
website
add.
that people can look up if they want. It's largely, as I say, just to do with design. So that's thegardendesigner.ie.
Okay, thegardendesigner.ie, folks, to look at some of Fintan's work. Fintan, thank you so much for coming on the show, and Liam, really appreciate you coming on the show, gentlemen. Really rich vein of conversation, as a phrase I think we coined here on the show. It's an information-rich environment, and hopefully, people found it educational. Probably a little bit controversial. It is a subject that really can get farmers' backs up at times. The notion that in somehow, you're telling people that they're damaging the landscape, or that they're kind of silently killing biodiversity and killing nature in the course of doing their jobs. It is a very, very controversial issue, and I just want to stress, we're not moralizing. We're certainly not blaming farmers. We're, if anything, we're saying, look, that there is a system, there are societal forces at play, bigger issues really than just farming, and really it might be a societal mindset and a societal approach. It's a controversial topic. It's something that maybe we hope to touch on in a future series of Grassroots, where we might actually talk about, what does good agricultural and environmental condition mean? What could it mean? What should it mean? How can we actually make schemes meaningfully impactful in terms of how they can, on the one hand, improve biodiversity, and on the one hand, both encourage farmers, educate farmers, and motivate farmers to actually engage in those practices, and to recognize farmers' crucial role, more so than obviously your average urban or peri-urban householder who doesn't have access to the land banks that farmers do. And farmers should be custodians, and they can be, and they could be, if they were encouraged and motivated to be custodians of the landscape and of our biodiversity. Gentlemen, we've had a really rich vein of conversation tonight. Again, just finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Fintan and Liam, our guests this evening, on what has been our penultimate show in our first series of Grassroots here on the Irish Inquiry. Just to round out, I'd like again to thank the Irish Inquiry for facilitating the discussion here this evening, for providing the platform, for providing all of the technical backup. You can, of course, look back at this show, and of course, don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that we have had 6 previous shows here on the Irish Inquiry Grassroots, and you can look back at all of those on our platforms. I'd encourage you, please, to provide your feedback, your comments, suggestions, recommendations, observations, or even topics that you would like us to cover in a second series, which will take a little bit of time to prepare, but which hopefully we will have for you in the autumn. And I suppose in that regard, I would urge people just to bear in mind that everything that happens here, from our guests and all of the backroom team, and everything that's done here is done pro bono. So it does actually, there's no large team of researchers, so a lot of work has gone into bringing the series to you, but it's also been a lot of fun, and it's been a huge educational journey, and a journey where I certainly have met a lot of wonderful new people and hopefully made some new friends. Gentlemen, if I could just finally ask you one question: would you be prepared to come back on the show with us again at some stage?
Absolutely, no problem. Peter,
happy to, sir. Yeah, happy as well, Peter. Thank
gentlemen,
you.
thanks very much for coming on again, because, ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't sit here and talk for over an hour, and I doubt anybody would want to listen to me for over an hour. So to our guests, because without the guests, there is no show. So thanks very much to our guests and to you, our viewers. If you've been watching us, for giving up over an hour on your Wednesday night, but hopefully you've gotten a lot from the program. But at this point, all that's left for me to say is to say thank you, and hopefully you'll tune in next week, where we're going to have what we hope will be a really interesting discussion on our last show of the season. So, go mé de ráisle chéile a ríis an teachtain sechuin, sláán go fóil agus banachtaí oribh go léir. From Grassroots, good night.